All right. Hey, everybody. Chuck Holton here. Thanks for watching The Hot Zone. Sorry I'm a couple minutes late there. I was running around looking for my glasses. Yeah, so glamorous, this job. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you. Thank you, One Tired Mama, and Rissa and Hannah for acting as our moderators. And wait, why isn't Hannah a moderator anymore? Did she stop being a moderator? I'm gonna make you moderator again, Hannah. Maybe that was the wrong Hannah. I don't know. Maybe it's a different Hannah. Well, we got a new Hannah moderator. All right. So first of all, we're not going to talk about Israel tonight because I've been getting a lot of people contacting me asking about, oh, that's a different Hannah. Well, congratulations, Hannah. You got the power glove tonight, so good for you. We're talking about this directive. It's called 5240.01. I've had several people contact me about it, not the least of which is our own Clarissa, meaning One Tired Mama. She wrote me and said, I wanted to ask if you've seen this. Apparently in September 2024, the DoD updated the directive to expand on what kind of situations and circumstances would allow U.S. military to use lethal force and control Americans. And so I've been getting this from a lot of people, and I thought I would address it, and we'd talk a little bit about it tonight, okay? So obviously people are very concerned about unrest around the election. And I just wrote a book about that. So it's good that we can talk about it tonight. And it's not just American citizens who are concerned about unrest around the election. It's also the government which is concerned about unrest around the election, because everybody can see it coming. Without a doubt, it is probably the most contentious. America is probably the most divided that we've seen it in years. Not ever. If you go back and read our history, there have been times when America was quite a bit more divided than we are now, and there was a lot more unrest than there is now. So unrest is sort of part and parcel with the transfer of power. Those people who have the power don't want to give it up, and those people that are getting the power are going to do what they can to keep it. So, especially after what we saw after the last presidential election, the left is terrified of right-wing political violence. Now, the crazy thing about that is it's actually the right that should be terrified about political violence, just based on recent history. Because if you go back and look at the amount of politically motivated violence that has taken place in America over the last 8 years, you will find between 150 and 200 incidents of left-wing motivated political violence. And it just depends on how you want to measure it, okay? I mean, the FBI still doesn't consider the Black Lives Matter protests to be politically motivated violence, and it caused over $2.1 billion in damage, and 25 people died. And the FBI still says, what political violence? We don't see any political violence here. But yet, they still say that Charlottesville was politically motivated violence when there was one guy who drove into a crowd of people and ran somebody over and killed somebody. When the only violence that took place was left-wing violence against the protesters. There were people who were protesting, and I'm not making excuses for those people, but they were protesting peaceably. If you go back and look at the footage, they were marching with signs and torches and things like that, and they were attacked by left-wing counter-protesters. So the violence started against the right, not because of it. But the FBI still calls that right-wing politically motivated violence. Now, I personally, if you're going to talk about politically motivated violence, I don't think you should count one lone wolf attacks where some kid goes into a Walmart and starts shooting, because, I mean, maybe he was anti-immigrant or whatever, but it's one guy. And there are crazy people all over the place. And I would venture to say that those incidences of violence, when you're talking about active shooter or active violence, where it's one guy that goes in and does some sort of violent act, I would say that almost all of them, the politics are not the motivating factor as much as the fact that they are incels. Almost all of those, you could say, are conducted by involuntary celibates. And this is a subset of people in the United States who are young men mostly, who spend an inordinate amount of time alone online, playing video games and watching pornography. And those two things have an especially toxic effect on a young man's brain, because he is alone, so he's not getting affection from really anybody. He's stuck in his room or in his basement, his mom's basement. He goes to school, nobody touches him there. He comes home, nobody touches him there. He goes downstairs and he's watching the most intimate of human acts on a nightly basis in, thousands of instances. And yet nobody will do that with him. Then he's going and he's playing these hyper-violent video games where anything goes. There are no rules of morality. Things like Grand Theft Auto, which, basically the whole point of the game is to break the law as much as possible. And this becomes his reality. And so he starts to live in a world where he's practicing breaking the law for hours every day. And then he's watching these very intimate acts on video, but nobody will touch him. And he starts to get angry. He gets this deep-seated rage and starts to want to take that out on society. Starts to blame the society for the depression that he's in. And then he eventually goes out and commits some act. And maybe he justifies it as being against immigrants, or justifies it as being against, people of color, whatever. But I would say that you shouldn't qualify those, shouldn't lump those in with mob violence that takes place in the streets, where people are flouting law enforcement and committing not just violent acts, but destructive acts just because they can. And those are politically motivated, without a doubt. So if you go back and try to count them up, I mean, it's hard, because most of the websites that you see that count that stuff, like the FBI, will work very hard to skew the data. They will lump in, for example, the Sandy Hook mass violence attack, or the one that was down in Florida on Valentine's Day, and call that politically motivated violence. No, it wasn't. It was a frustrated kid who was angry at the world, who went and took it out on a school. It wasn't, because he was a MAGA follower. That's what you see this every time. Even the people who have been trying to kill the president of the United States, or former president, I guess, in recent time, the media is trying to make him out to be one of that guy's supporters. So there's a lot of sort of misinformation, people being disingenuous in the way that they report this stuff. But I did the best I could. And I could come up with between 150 and 200 politically motivated riots, okay, events in the United States in the last 8 years. And of those, I could find 2 that you could maybe qualify as right-wing violence. January 6th and the Charlottesville thing, which I've already explained, was not really violent on the side of the right. I mean, the only person that died in the January 6th that was directly related to the January 6th event was one of the protesters who was shot by a police officer. And so it's, even though there was some minor property destruction and a whole bunch of angry people, there was very little actual violence or, intentional vandalism and things like that. But those are the only 2 that you could come up with. I even asked ChatGPT if it could come up with any more incidents of right-wing violence, and the only thing it kept coming up with was Charlottesville and January 6th. That literally was the only thing it could find. It tried to, spout some of the things from the FBI website that talk about, mass active violence events. But like I say, I'm discounting those because I believe it was something else entirely. Suffice it to say, 99% of all of the politically motivated riots that we have seen over the last 8 years have come from the left. And so people understand that on a visceral level. You understand that on a visceral level. Even if the media is telling you otherwise, you get it. And so because of that, when you see these things coming out that the government is preparing, you're seeing it on X and you're seeing it on the media, that this directive was issued and it gives the U.S. military the ability to use lethal force against American citizens, you're going to sit up and take notice of that. You're going to go like, hey, wait a minute. That's not cool. Well, the problem is you're being bombarded from 2 directions. I want to talk about that a little more in a minute. But first of all, let's go through this particular rumor and talk about it. This directive is from the Department of Defense, 5240.01, which documents procedures when there's a potential use of lethal force. Now, when I actually went through the document, what I found is that it doesn't actually give the government any powers that it didn't have already. It clarifies a few things, but it does not expand U.S. military powers to control or use lethal force against Americans. What it does is outline the Department of Defense policy on intelligence-related, intelligence gathering activities, and the assistance that these intelligence components, like the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, can provide to law enforcement agencies and other, like civil authorities, right? So they're talking about, can the DIA or the NSA provide certain assistance to your local police force or to a federal police force, something that's inside the United States. And there is a clause in there that talks about the use of lethal force, which I'll get to in a minute. But first of all, I want to point out that this document stipulates that the DoD can only provide assistance to law enforcement in very specific cases, and particularly cases in which lives are in danger. So it would be like if there was a terror threat, an imminent threat of a terror attack somewhere in the United States, like maybe the Boston Marathon bombing, the DIA or the Defense Department could potentially provide intelligence to local law enforcement to help them get ahead of that attack. So it's specialized to sharing intelligence, technical support, or certain equipment. Now, give you an example. When I flew helicopters 100 years ago for the National Guard in Wisconsin, one of the things we did in the summertime was we went out and flew every day around these gigantic cornfields all over Wisconsin, because as it turned out, these drug runners were going out in the middle of the cornfields and pulling up stalks of corn and planting marijuana in the middle. So from the road, it looks like corn, but from the air, you can see this square in the middle, and it's easy to find. We did that every day all summer long. It was actually a great job. I just went out and flew around in circles all day. But we did a special mission while we were there because they were finding these aircraft that were coming across the border from Canada, and they were coming very low, trying to stay under the radar or whatever, and they were flying in bales of marijuana from Canada into the United States. So the local law enforcement and the DEA reached out to the Defense Department and said, look, we're going to surge some troops up there, some cops up there to try to deal with this, but we need help catching these aircraft that are coming across the border. So the Defense Department loaned us a special aircraft that had a downward-looking radar in the nose cone and sent it up there to fly around in circles above the northern border. And then these guys could see the aircraft that were coming in under the normal radar. And then they could call us. We'd go up there and fly around in circles too. And then they'd call us on the radio and they would vector us in on those aircraft, and we would essentially pull them over and search them. And they were sometimes squawking the wrong frequency, or just flying in a way that was erratic, that was they were just flying like, yeah. So they would vector us in, we would pull them over, and we'd catch these guys that were trying to smuggle drugs across the northern border. That was a accepted use of shared intelligence resources and equipment and support from, actually it was the CIA that owned the airplane. So that's one example of that. Okay, now, when it comes to lethal force, this particular document, 5210.01, stipulates that the use of force, what it did is they changed the language slightly. They just clarified it. And it says it's explicitly limited to use lethal force in the United States against American citizens. Any support involving legal force requires the approval of the Secretary of Defense and might also require presidential authorization. Now, that applies when it's reasonably foreseen that the support might result in lethal outcomes, such as in civil disturbances or certain emergency responses. And that's section 3.3 of that document. And that's the part that was clarified, such as in civil disturbances and certain emergency responses. Now, if you were somebody who didn't trust the government a whole lot, and you saw that they just added something in that said civil disturbances or certain emergency responses, and you thought about January 6th, or you thought about what just happened in Hurricanes Milton and Helene in, Tennessee and North Carolina and places like that, you might get all excited and go, oh, wait a minute, they just added civil disturbances and certain emergency responses to things that might be used for lethal force. But if you read it carefully, what it's actually doing is it's adding those things in specific to things that would require the specific written approval of the Secretary of Defense and or the President of the United States. Whereas before, those were maybe left up to the commander on the ground. They were maybe left up to some subordinate commander. Now what they've done is they have specified that if it's a civil disturbance or emergency response, like to a hurricane, if any of the support that these intelligence units of the Defense Department, we're not talking about U.S. soldiers necessarily, we're not talking about infantry troops, we're talking specifically about spooks that work for the Defense Intelligence Agency or, ancillary agencies like that. Intel guys. But if any of their support might possibly cause a situation that would result in lethal outcomes, then it must be authorized by the President or the Secretary of Defense in writing for every case. How do we know that that's what it's talking about? Well, it says that pretty specifically there. That's, again, section 3.3 of that, if you want to go look it up. But it also goes on to specifically uphold the Posse Comitatus Act, which is 18 U.S. Code section 1385, which generally prohibits the use of any federal military force to perform domestic law enforcement activities in the United States, unless it is explicitly authorized by Congress or by the Constitution, like in the case of an invasion. So, while I can see where people who are already on a hair trigger in their distrust of the U.S. government might say, whoa, hang on, they just changed this and reissued it. This is a document that's been out there for a long time. And they periodically update the document. The last time it was updated before today, or before this week, was 2017, I think. And so, it was due for an update. And so they go through and they just have their lawyers check through this document and make sure that it's still relevant. And they might make a few small changes like that. I can virtually guarantee that whoever made that change was specifically thinking about January 6th and the Hurricane Helene response, or maybe they were thinking about, other hurricane responses or whatever. But it just is freaking people out that this came out right before the election. Well, it was probably a scheduled update anyway. And so it's probably not, this is speculation on my part, but it's just from my understanding about the way these arcane legal documents work, is that they are scheduled for updates long in advance. So they probably had been working on this for a year, and it just happened to come out now. And so I'm, let's just put it this way. What initially made me skeptical when I saw this coming out on Twitter and saw it, being spread around, was who was spreading it. Because if it's coming out on InfoWars, or if it's coming out on, some of those kinds of shows, then you should immediately be skeptical. Not because everything they put out is untrue or wrong. As a matter of fact, a lot of the things that they put out in 2020 ended up being correct, but because they definitely have a strong agenda. And to be fair, I'm equally skeptical when I see something reported by CNN or MSNBC. Okay, these are two sides of the spectrum. But just because of who they are and because of their sort of penchant for reporting things in such a way, or spinning things in such a way that they fit the narrative that they espouse, which is terribly anti-government, then I'm automatically just going to be like, I'm going to double check that. I'm going to do that if somebody sends me something from CNN, and I'm going to do it if they send me something from InfoWars, for the same reason, because both sides are extremely wedded to their politics. And I want to be as fair as possible. Now, I recognize that I would be more likely to believe something from Steve Bannon than I would be from Anderson Cooper, because I'm a conservative, and I'm a Christian, and I don't trust the government. And so, I would be more likely to believe something like that, but I want to know the truth. And so when one of my friends or family members comes to me and says, I heard that the government is, that they directed the hurricane to hit the red state and then didn't send aid, just so make it difficult to vote in those areas, that they're doing that on purpose. I go, whoa, wait a minute. Let's maybe not jump all the way to blaming the government for causing hurricanes on purpose to interfere with the elections. That is a bit of a stretch to me. So let's go look into it a little further. And the one thing that people don't do is they'll pass around this obscure DOD directive. Oh, Directive 5210.56 says, but they didn't actually read it. And who could blame them? But we have things like u.com now. You can go to u.com and you can drop in that document and say, summarize this document and tell me what it says specifically about the use of lethal force, and it will jump you right to the correct section. U.com and perplexity.com are perplexity.ai are two places I go to look for help in summarizing things. You could go to ChatGPT, but what you're going to get is going to be skewed a little bit to the left. And when I point that out to ChatGPT, like, hey, you just told me that the violence that took place in Black Lives Matter wasn't really violent because of your biases. But how much property damage was caused by the Black Lives Matter protests? And ChatGPT will say, oh, it was $2.1 billion. And then I'll say, well, then ChatGPT, how can you tell me it was not violent? And ChatGPT will go, oh, you're right, it was violent. If you point out how they are wrong, okay, so Tim Miller is watching. He's contacting me and telling me I'm wrong about the DIA. So maybe I'm using the DIA as an example here, and I shouldn't be, because I trust Tim. I mean, Tim definitely knows a thing or two about the federal government. So when it's talking about intel agencies of the Department of Defense, I was making an assumption we were talking about organizations like the DIA. So Tim, if it is, okay, so actually, Tim is saying we should be alarmed about this. So what I'll do is I'll get Tim on a live. We'll do a live together, and we'll talk about this. But so I'm gonna go on with what studying that I did here, and then we'll let Tim come on and tell me why I'm wrong. And I certainly could be wrong. I'm sitting here telling you that I don't trust the government, and that the government certainly is making preparations for the potential unrest that we will see after this election, without a doubt. No doubt whatsoever. The government is expecting violence. Now, what the thing that really is concerning to me is that when you read the FBI's analysis of this stuff, when you read the U.S. military analysis of this stuff, they will only talk about right-wing violence. They say that right-wing violence is on the rise, and they won't say anything about left-wing violence, but it is clear to anybody who understands arithmetic that there is a lot more left-wing violence in the last 8 years than right-wing violence. And yet the FBI, local law enforcement, the US government, all the way up to the president, are claiming just the opposite. And so this is the concern. This is the thing that we should be concerned about. If the government is warning you that they are expecting right-wing violence after the election, you should be expecting left-wing violence after the election. No question. They always accuse others of doing what they themselves are doing. Okay? They always do that. So this is why we should be concerned. Now, let's talk about what you can do. So I want to, first of all, just point out another story that came out today that sort of dovetails into what we're talking about. It's not talking specifically about this particular DoD directive, but I just want to point out one thing. Russia is working overtime to sow mistrust and division and chaos in our elections, in our country. And so they are like full court press, putting out disinformation campaigns, spreading false narratives, or taking true narratives and elevating them, making mountains out of molehills, so to speak. And doing everything they can to amplify any divisive issues in the United States. So this is a known fact that the Russians they've got tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands or even millions of fake accounts out there on social media that are pushing misinformation and disinformation to amplify divisions in the United States, to stoke racial tensions, to cause people to be very skeptical of even the most common sense things that are put out by the government, and to fracture America's any unity we have left. the ultimate goal of that is to undermine the trust in our election system. They don't just do this in America. They do this all over the world. And they're not the only ones. Iran is doing it. China's doing it. So when you've got all of these state actors working very hard to undermine your belief in your country and to make you distrustful of your neighbors, that's something that you need to counter. It's something you need to be aware of. And so the main thrust of what I want to talk about today is what's coming next here. I want to talk about what you can do to keep your family safe in the America that we're going to see coming very, very soon. It's already here, but it's going to get worse. Now, yeah, Papa Joe 1950 says, be careful not to get suckered into another January 6th. Yeah, for sure. The scary thing is, and I think maybe this is to Tim's point, when you're talking about this particular DOD directive, the real question is, who is deciding what is a reasonable use of force? And because this directive doesn't make specific, it's not terribly specific about what exactly are the times when they can use force. Well, depending on who the president is, depending on who the Secretary of Defense is, that could be broadly enough defined that it could be used against normal citizens. And so how can we keep our families safe in the case of general or localized violence surrounding these elections and going forward? Because depending on who gets elected, I'm telling you right now, if the left loses this election, they will do everything they can to tear this country apart. We saw them do it the last time, and it'll be worse this time. So if you're worried about the war in Ukraine or the war in Israel, and you're living in the United States, I think you need to be a little more worried and preparing for the war that's coming in the United States. So let's talk about this. And I want to answer your question, Gustav, so I'm going to, maybe I can pin that. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to pin that message so that I'll remember that question so I can answer that in a minute. But I want to go through these things because this is stuff, the book that I just released called The Death of Civilization is really a book to help you get prepared for the death of civilization. And it's how to prepare your family. Now, because there are so many people out there, state actors, that are trying to divide us, the very first thing I'll say is that the gist of my book is that we should start doing more to unify with our neighbors and the people that we live near, the people in your neighborhood, the people in your church. This is what the book is really about. And so the more you can come together, if you look back 50 years, 75 years in this country, when I was a kid, we had neighborhood barbecues and just everybody in the neighborhood was invited. We had, when it was Halloween, man, everybody was out for Halloween. Christmas, we went around our neighborhood and went Christmas caroling. I just don't see that a lot anymore. And so I think that we should get back to that. And that's really kind of the gist of my book. But let's go through some concrete things that you can do to make sure that you're safe on and after Election Day. Number one, if it looks like there's going to be some politically motivated mob violence, then you need to, number one, stay informed. And you don't want to just be watching the news. You want to be looking at what's happening in your neighborhood, where you are. So there are some apps that will help you with that. Facebook usually has a neighborhood app for each neighborhood. There's one for my neighborhood here in Panama. There's one for my neighborhood in West Virginia. Okay, so there you can go to Facebook and join those. And then if there's a mob that's gathering near your neighborhood, or if it looks like there's going to be some violence between you and where you have to go to work, you might get alerted so that you can avoid that. Other apps, or there's an app called Citizen, which is very full-featured, but it's also, you have to pay for it. Matter of fact, I'm going to show you that one right there. This is the Citizen app, and it calls itself the world's most intelligent personal safety service. And so, like I say, you do have to pay for it, but it has monitoring of where you are, tells you about things that are happening in your area. They have people who are, you can even listen in to law enforcement radio broadcasts and things like that. Okay, so if you're really concerned, maybe sign up for this just around the election. Okay, and it tells you what's going on in your area, but it will also direct law enforcement or an ambulance or something to your location if you're not at home, if you're on the move. So if you get stuck in a backup that's caused because a bunch of jack wagons are stopping traffic somewhere in town, you could potentially call and get help, and your location can be shown here, okay? So they can dispatch emergency services to you, get somebody to you to evacuate you. And there's lots of different reports. I looked at it. It can tell you where there are registered sex offenders in your area, all sorts of stuff like that, okay? But again, it's very limited in what it will do if you don't pay for it. So it is a paid service, all right? So that's one option. Another option is called Nextdoor. And so you can go look up Nextdoor. I think it's nextdoor.com. And it's just another service that it's like a classified ads and neighborhood watch and stuff like that. My mother, when she was still alive, there was a Nextdoor group in her neighborhood that if there was somebody that lost a dog, hey, I saw a dog running by with a collar on, they might know who it belongs to. Or, hey, there's a strange guy that looks like a porch pirate that's checking out people's porches for packages and stealing them, that sort of thing. And so you could go to Nextdoor and you could sign up for a neighborhood. But that's one way that you can be monitoring the area that you're in, very specific to you, local areas. Number two, you want to avoid known hotspots. That's kind of a Captain Obvious thing there. If they regularly have protests in the town square or on Main Street or something like that, well, when they're having a protest, might be a good time to avoid those areas and, let them pass on by. Maybe even change your travel plans if you're going to go visit your kids over the holidays and they live in Baltimore or South Chicago or Los Angeles or someplace like that, Washington, D.C., God forbid. Maybe have them come visit you instead. So think about those things and make your decisions based on a security mindset. Number 3, and this is something you can do between now and the election, is go around your home and make sure your home is secure. Reinforce your doors and windows. Put stronger locks on. Maybe get some of that. It's not very expensive to go on Amazon and get a security film, and you can put that film on your windows and make your windows safer, harder to break, right? So these are just common sense things that you could probably think of on your own, but I'm just here to remind you of. Make sure you've got your security cameras installed. Make sure that they're working and they're recording and your hard drive isn't full on your camera system and stuff like that. Okay? Then you want to make sure you've got a first aid kit and a fire extinguisher, just normal stuff, right? This is important, especially if you are in your third stage of your life. If you're elderly or a senior citizen, make sure that you've got a good communication plan, and not just that you have your kids' numbers dialed in on speed dial or something like that, but maybe your neighbors should know who your next of kin is. Maybe some people at your church ought to have those numbers for how to get a hold of your family if you are, for some reason, incapacitated. This is something we have to deal with a lot here in Panama, because we have a lot of retirees that move into this little neighborhood, this little town that we're in, up in the mountains. And it's a very idyllic place to live. It's cheaper than most places in the States. And so a lot of retirees like to come here. However, and we get to know them because we live here and we make friends with them and stuff. But then they have a stroke or they have a car accident or something like that happens. And they haven't told anybody who their next of kin is. They haven't told anybody who their family is in the States or how to get a hold of them. And so we're scrambling around. We've had people die and we didn't know who to contact to come get their stuff. So it would be just a self-aware thing to do, to write down a list of contacts of people that if you, God forbid, for some reason are incommunicado, your neighbor, the law enforcement in your town, or somebody can find that list and can call those people. Because if it's on speed dial in your phone, well, guess what? Your phone needs your face or your fingerprint. And if you're lost or they can't find you, then they're just stuck and you can't get that help. So this is important. It's something that I know a lot of people who watch my broadcasts are 65 and over. Actually, the greatest percentage of people watching me right now are 65 and over. And so this is me begging you to write down a list of your kids, their phone numbers, their email addresses, and not just one, but several, and your pastor, and your deacon, and your neighbor, and things like that. Do your kids know who to contact if they can't get a hold of you for some reason? Let's say you just stop answering the phone. Do your kids know the phone number for your neighbors? To have somebody that can walk next door and knock on the door to see if you're still alive? We've had this problem as well. It's very good to make a list of those things and pass them out to people and say, hey, just in case, would you just keep this somewhere? And, or hey, on my refrigerator, I've got a list of names and phone numbers of people that are important to me in my life. So something like that, okay? So I would also, let's move on, create an emergency kit, just a duffel bag that you throw in your car that's got food and water and medications, a first aid kit, maybe some extra clothes, flashlight, whatever. Just if you don't have one of those in your car, why not? You should. It's not that big a deal. Just throw some stuff in a bag and just have it in your trunk and just leave it there. You'll probably never need it, but if you do, you'll be very, very glad you have it. Also, do you have some extra cash on hand? Because in a failure of civility, very often ATMs are not available, credit cards don't work, the power's out, whatever. It doesn't hurt to have a $100 bill rolled up and stuck in your phone case, just underneath fold it up and stick it in your phone case behind your phone, or maybe in your belt buckle, or I've seen lots of different places where you can stash a $100 bill. But as somebody who travels around the world a lot, believe me, I'm always carrying some form of currency on me, because even if you're someplace where you are able to use your credit card a lot, it never hurts to have a little cash. KP1 says, closed shoes people, thank you very much. I should write a whole chapter about wearing closed-toed shoes. My lovely wife just lost a toenail because she wasn't wearing closed-toed shoes. But, hey, you got to be fashionable. I'm not going to criticize her. But I used to own a tour company, and the guy that was my tour guide that drove people out into the jungle was in the habit of wearing flip-flops everywhere. And I kept telling him, you have to wear closed-toed shoes. And he was like, why? I don't want to wear, it's uncomfortable. I was like, I don't care. You have to wear closed-toed shoes. Well, there were a couple times when he had to, carry somebody up a hill, and he was very glad he had closed-toed shoes on. I am a big advocate of not wearing flip-flops. If you are out in public, if you're not at the swimming pool or the beach and you're wearing flip-flops, I think you're just unprepared. You're woefully unprepared in the case of some emergency. If you can't sprint all out wearing what you're wearing, then maybe you should be wearing something different. That's my, war correspondent coming out in me. But I almost always am dressed in a way that I could sprint full out if I had to and carry somebody, because that happens. Now, if there's a time of unrest, staying home is usually an option. Maybe call in sick to work, or, work remotely that day. Just stay home. Make sure you've got enough essentials at home that you could stay there for a week or 10 days or 15 days if you had to. I mean, after the sickness that we had in 2020, I can't say its name or I'll get banned from YouTube. We got locked down with 24 hours notice in our home in Panama, and they said, oh, it's going to be 15 days. And then it ended up being 10 and a half months. And so I am much better prepared now than I was then, because I never would have imagined in my wildest dreams that something could happen, realistically could happen in my lifetime, where the government would say, you cannot leave your home for 10 and a half months. And believe me, they made it illegal to drink a beer, not buy or sell alcohol, but consume alcohol in your own home. It was illegal in Panama. And we were like, yeah, right. Good luck with that. We got nothing else to do. So if I can't sit on my porch and have a glass of wine once in a while, I'm sorry, but you're not going to tell me I can't do that. The problem was you couldn't buy it anywhere. And so are you prepared for the next lockdown? Let's just put it that way. Maybe you don't drink wine. That's great. Good for you. I don't drink much anymore either. But are you prepared for another government lockdown? There's nobody out there now who could, dismiss the idea that the government could possibly force you to stay in your home for 2 weeks, because we all lived through it. It happened. So be ready for the next one. On the opposite side of that, are you aware of all the ways you could get out of your neighborhood if you had to? What if there was a mob of people blocking the road out of your neighborhood and you needed to get out? Is there a different way out of your neighborhood? Are you in a cul-de-sac? What if, and this is where I want to come to my point, where sometimes survival comes down to thinking outside the box and being unreasonable and being willing to break the rules. In a time of emergency, the rules are just suggestions. And so the median between, the northbound and southbound traffic, normally it's illegal for you to cross that median. Well, in a time of crisis, especially if there's a mob of rioters coming toward you down the street, drive over the curb, run over a few bushes, and make a U-turn and get the heck out of there. Don't be afraid to break the rules if that's what it takes to keep you safe. And if you want to know more about how to keep yourself safe, I would highly recommend you go check out Tim Miller's podcast here on YouTube. This Lionheart Services. I never can get that right. Just look up Tim Miller Lionheart on YouTube and you can find his podcast. Maybe Rissa can put the link up to Tim Miller's podcast for us in the chat. But Tim does a great job of helping you learn to be more aware, learn to take action. And so now I want to ask you, what do you think are the chances that there will be another government mandated lockdown in the next 4 years? 1 through 10. 1 being certainty, 10 being no, it's not going to happen. So give me a 1 through 10 in the chat box. What do you think are the chances we will have another government mandated lockdown? So 10, One Tired Mama says it's not going to happen. Everybody says it's not going to happen. Or maybe you mean, you're not doing that right. I said a 1 is you are sure it's going to happen. A 10 is you are sure it's not going to happen. Maybe you're saying 10, it's not going to happen because the government is going to do it and you're going to say to heck with that and you're not going to comply. Yeah, okay, so that's what I thought. I think most people are leaning toward that there will be another lockdown. So I would just tell you, prepare accordingly. Thank you very much, Priscilla. Thank you for that. Now, I want to get to Gustav's question. He asked me, how do you regard what happened on January 6th? Do you think it should have been stopped? Is anyone responsible for getting the crowd to ransack the Capitol? Well, they didn't ransack the Capitol. There were a few guys who picked things up and moved things, got their picture taken. Nobody was setting anything on fire. Nobody was, spray painting things inside the Capitol. I think there might have been a few windows broken. Then that was about it. So there wasn't massive ransacking happening at the Capitol. There were a lot of people jumping up and down outside that were very upset. And there were a few people who were ushered in, from what I can tell, by law enforcement, who were allowed inside, and they walked in, took some pictures, and then left peaceably, and they have now spent years in jail because of it. I don't think that you could reasonably call what happened on January 6th a riot. I just don't. From what I've seen, I wasn't there, but from people that I've talked to who were there, and from what I've seen in the videos, it was a very vigorous protest. And there were some people who got out of hand. I am virtually certain that there were left-wing agents provocateurs in the crowd. And so that's probably enough to get me kicked off YouTube, and I'm going to stop right there. But I'm just going to say that make sure you don't get yourself into a situation where it could happen again. I'm not saying that you shouldn't protest if protests are warranted. There are massive protests in Washington, D.C. every year, protesting for life, against abortion, and they're not violent. Any violence that would ever happen would be against those protesters, not because of them. They leave the place cleaner than they found it. And so any protest ought to stay that way. There's another section that I am starting to write now that probably should have gone into the book that I just finished, the Death of Civilization book. But I didn't have time to include it, but I am going to put it out after the election. And that is how to vote with your feet. Because I know there are a lot of people who feel like I do that peaceful protest doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. I've been to lots of protests. I've rarely seen a lot of change because of those protests. The thing that actually causes change is when you cost people money. And so if you cost the government money, then the government sits up and takes notice. And so there are a lot of people who have been asking, is it time to, pick up a tool? Is it time to pick up a tool if the election gets, irregularities? And I'll say, I don't believe it's time to do that just yet, but I definitely, I got to the point in 2012 where I decided that it was time for me to vote with my feet and to take concrete steps to reduce the amount of money that I send to the system, to the tax system. And to do that legally, one of the best ways I could do it was moving out of the United States. Now, I am a patriot through and through. Don't you dare try to call me a traitor for moving out of the United States, because I fought and bled for America and would do so again. But one of the reasons that I moved out of the United States is specifically because I was tired of seeing my tax dollars being used to destroy my country. And with an Obama administration in power or a Biden administration in power, that is exactly what they are trying to do. And so I just don't want to fund that. And if enough people stop funding it one way or another, then maybe things will have to change. They will be forced to change. And we can do it without violence. So I'm working on it now. I'm going to put out another pamphlet soon, booklet on chuckholton.com for people who are interested in potentially voting with their feet. That doesn't necessarily mean leaving the United States, by the way. There are a lot of people that are doing it, leaving California, leaving New York, high tax areas, and moving to lower tax areas. SpaceX did it. Elon Musk did it. So it doesn't necessarily mean moving out of the US, but it might. And so I want to give you some advice from somebody who did that himself 13 years ago. All right? So that's about all I've got for today. I hope that I answered that question for you, Gustav. I'm going to remove that now. And I should have just unpinned it. Sorry. There's a lot of people who are moving to Florida, a lot of people moving to Texas, and a lot of people who are moving to the American Redoubt which is Eastern Oregon and Idaho and Washington, right? So we can talk more about that, but I'm just so you know, I'm working on a paper about that I'm going to put out and make available to those of you who are interested. Okay. All right. So thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you. And like I say, I mean, we need to revisit this DOD directive, because my good friend, Tim Miller, who I trust very implicitly and who knows more about the federal government than any human being I am personally acquainted with, says that I'm wrong in saying that it's not such a big deal, the changes that they made. He says it is. And so I've been wrong before, and I want to hear what he has to say. So Tim and I will do a live together, maybe tomorrow, and we'll talk more about this. So make sure that you go and subscribe to chuckholton.com. That is my insurance policy. If I accidentally say something here on YouTube that gets me deplatformed, we've got people signing up over there. And if I disappear off YouTube for some reason, you can find me at chuckholton.com. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe over there, but you can sign up for $7 a month and support our work to help keep us independent, keep us over there out in the field doing these reports. And I would encourage you to do that. If you become a supporter, you get access to the 2 books that I put out recently. One is the one I've been talking about here. It's called Death of Civilization. And the other one is called The Grace Project. It's about putting together a crisis preparedness team at your church. And so if you want to get those books, I'm not going to send you a physical book. I just want to make that clear. You are not going to get a hardcover in the mail. People have been sending me their addresses. It is a download. It's a PDF file, or I can actually send you an EPUB file if you know how to put that into Kindle, if you want to read it on your Kindle. So go to chuckholton.com, become a supporter, and you can download those books as a paying supporter. There's a lot more you can get as a supporter as well. That's supporter-only content. And I'm doing everything I can. We had a meeting today with our business manager to brainstorm on a bunch of other stuff that we can put on there to make it worthwhile for you to continue being a supporter, because you're going to get a lot of really good extra content, and you're going to love it, okay? So we're trying to make it very valuable for you to do that, okay? So go to chuckholton.com, please, and sign up as a supporter over there, and you'll have my gratitude. All right, God bless you. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.